All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. My name is Matt Campbell, and today I'm going to be doing a brief GPU technical perspective on Avowed. A little bit about myself before we begin. I'm a senior graphics engineer at Obsidian Entertainment. I was the lead graphics engineer on Avowed. I've got over 15 years of experience shipping games, having worked on versions of Unreal all the way back to UE2. And I've shipped games on multiple consoles and platforms. So a little bit about Avowed, if you're not aware of what it is. It's a single-player action RPG. We shipped on Xbox Series S and X as well as PC. It's set in the Pillars of Eternity universe. In Avowed, you can play as either first or third person. It's a combination of melee, ranged, and spell-based combat with heavy focuses on story, exploration, and parkour/navigation. In Avowed, we had about 5 large open zones and about 25 hard-loaded maps. So a little bit more about the team size of Avowed. At its peak, Avowed had about a team size with 100 internal devs and 40 external co-devs. And that was further subdivided into like a 15-person tech team with a technical director, 2 internal graphics engineers, myself being one of them, along with 2 additional external co-devs, 5 engine and tools programmers, internal with 2 additional co-devs, 3 technical artists, and 2 lighters. So we're a little bit light on some of the engineering stuff, and so therefore we had to be pretty precise with where we made changes and moved with Avowed. So early on, Avowed started all the way back in UE4. I believe it was 4.22 or 4.23. And for the purposes of this talk, the project goals that we were really looking for were a open or near open world, big, large vistas, looking out onto the maps, a fully dynamic time of day with a lot of natural lighting using global illumination, and a very organic world with lots of foliage, caves, and whatnot. When we shipped, we shipped on Unreal Engine 5.3.2 on Series S and X as PC, like I said. And we pretty much tried to make use of every major Unreal Engine 5 technology available to us: Nanite, Lumen, virtual shadow maps, virtual textures, Niagara, and whatnot. For the purposes of this talk, I'm really going to be focusing on the top 3, but I will have a slide on virtual textures. So when we shipped on Series X, we had 2 quality modes. We had 2 modes. We had a quality mode running at 30 hertz, where we rendered to an internal resolution of 900p. We rendered full hardware ray traced Lumen, and we used a combination of virtual shadow maps for our directional light and hardware ray tracing for our local lights. And then we did hardware ray tracing reflections for both Lumen and single layer water. On our balance mode, which was running at 40 hertz on TVs that supported it, we rendered to an internal resolution of 1280p, 1280p, 720p, that's Series X. Again, we use full hardware Lumen with virtual shadow map directional light and hardware ray trace local lights. Here we did ray tracing for our Lumen reflections, but for single layer water, we just did these green space reflection already. On Xbox Series X, we had 3 modes. We had our quality mode targeting 30 hertz, where we rendered internally at 1440p. Again, hardware Lumen, virtual shadow map, directional light, ray trace local lights, and full ray trace reflections. Balance mode at 40 hertz, we're rendering at 1280p. Similar target specs as above. And then we also had a performance mode running at 60 hertz. On this one, we targeted 1080p up to 1800p. And we used software Lumen along with full virtual shadow maps for directional and local lights, as well as software Lumen for our reflections and single layer water. Although this actually was not a GPU limitation, this was all CPU limited at the time, so that's why we ended up going there. So here we have some pictures from Avowed. So here we have a picture of Dawnshore looking over Paradise. We have a nighttime shot of Dawnshore. Here's one from Emerald Stair. Here we have Nakaku Bell, Ringworm's Domain, Gallowing Tusks, another from Gallowing Tusk in the archive, and Solace Keep. So, beginning with Nanite. Nanite was used extensively on Avowed. Anything and everything we did, we made Nanite. And this was one of the biggest contributors to Avowed's success. It allowed for our vast vistas with minimal LED popping. And it was vital for keeping our memory under control. Especially on the consoles, memory was a constant struggle for us. So being able to have everything pooled for our meshes was key. And we ended up having to spend a lot of time doing that. And it actually ended up taking a major effort by our art and tech art teams to do this. Coming from UE4, we ended up having a lot of masked materials anything and everything we did had frilly bits to it that we had to convert over. And that took a lot of effort for performance. And of course, we also loved our splines. So we had to end up baking splines because Nanite at the time did not support that. Once we got everything merged over and converted to opaque geometry, we found that we were pretty much on Nanite, as far as Nanite goes, bottlenecked by our materials. They were overly complicated. This was another holdover from UE4 where we didn't have as much geometry. So we ended up doing a lot more work in our materials than we probably should have. Nanite already is kind of high on the VGPR and VLU usage. And then when we added in our complicated materials with multiple texture samples, it just got even higher. And as a result, our occupancy was never quite where we wanted it to be. Also, our heavy use of virtual textures made us texture address bound in these guys all the time. And since we were on 5.3, we didn't have any access to Nanite's compute shading or VRS. So we paid pixel per pixel. Additionally, all of our variations were done primarily through material instances, not custom primitive data. So we ended up having a lot of passes on our base pass that were called away and ended up being empty base pass draws. Pretty much at the time, if it's loaded, Nanite has to issue the draw call for it, even if it gets called away. And so it was very common for us to have 1 to 2, maybe even more 100 nanoseconds of just empty draw calls on the base pass. Work graphs in the future should help address this, but obviously we did not have those. And even then, we still found that oftentimes we were getting, we were overloading Nanite in the calling passes, having too much streamed in. We weren't necessarily baking our HLODs a lot at first. This was something we've really cracked down on and enforced later on in the game, and it had to do. And then, of course, we also had to adjust a lot of our streaming sizes. The hope originally was that we could have one streaming cell per world partition tile, but we ended up having to have a lot more as the game progressed, so we could get stuff like knee height and below out of the scenes earlier and removed from our LOD0 incident meshes. Foliage. Foliage was another thing that took quite a bit of effort on our art teams. Again, coming from UE4, everything was non-Nanite masked cards. They had pretty expensive WinSims on them. They had a lot of visual lotting issues, and they were not at all performant with virtual shadow maps. When Nanite did start supporting foliage, or you could put foliage in Nanite, we tried immediately just making everything our alpha masked cards. And while it fixed our lotting issues, it did not fix our render times at all. Pretty much it moved all of our bad non-Nanite VSM times to become bad Nanite rasterization times. So ultimately, we ended up breaking down and moving everything from mask to opaque that we could. And this was vital to cut down on all the per pixel operations and make our rasterization as fast as possible. We still ended up using WinSims, but we had to change them quite a bit. On our trees, we ended up using VATs and WPO, but we did find this limiting ultimately. We were limited in how many vertices we could have. They were expensive memory-wise, so it's something that while we ship with it, we're going to reevaluate, and especially with all the new Lumen foliage stuff coming out, or not Lumen foliage, Nanite foliage. And even then, with all that stuff, we still ended up being very aggressive with our WPO disabling at distance. We brought things in really close at times, and this was really key to keeping our rasterization times down. And ultimately, on a lot of assets, we ended up removing it entirely, especially a lot of the clutter on the ground, the clovers, the little flowers, and everything like that, that had to be turned off to keep our performance in line. And even then, there were some assets, such as our cover graphs, which we couldn't make opaque. We have a dithering effect on it when you enter in, so we had to leave that as masked. But to account for this, we did a couple different things. The first thing was we just modeled it as opaque. This helped keep down on the overdraw as best it could. We also limited the vertice count. These guys, I think, are around 3,000 verts. And they're also quite sparse, which seemed to help Nanite rasterize them as best it could. So here we've got a couple comparisons of the game in alpha right after we switched over to our final engine version. So these timings are for Xbox Series S under 30 Hz mode. So in alpha, or pretty late in alpha, I would say, we were sitting at a total frame time here in this scene outside of Paradise at about 46.5 milliseconds. And we were spending about 4 milliseconds on our Nanite Viz buffer, 5 milliseconds on our base pass, and we were spending about 13 milliseconds in our shadow depth pass. And in this particular one, we have this masked Bram Believes material, which doesn't really affect the scene much, but it's still taking 1.5 milliseconds to rasterize. After we had made all those changes, converted everything from masked to opaque, adjusted our streaming distances, disabled WPO, we were able to get our final frame time down to about 30 milliseconds on Series S. We ended up having our Nanite Viz buffer at about 2.5 milliseconds and actually moved the hardware and software from overlapping to being sequential on the graphics cube. And then we were able to overlap that with the ray tracing scene update. That saved us time. We got our base pass down to 3.5 milliseconds, and our VSM cost dropped all the way down to 8. Although this is partially a result of us moving over to ray tracing for local lights, which we'll get to later. Here's another example from Emerald Stair. In this particular frame on Series S at 30 Hertz, we were initially rendering at about 53 milliseconds. Pretty similar timings on the Viz buffer and base pass, except our shadow depth pass was much, much worse, sitting at 20 milliseconds. And this red foliage you can see here was taking about 6 milliseconds to render in the shadow depth pass. Again, making sure everything was moved to opaque, adjusting streaming distances, killing WPO at a distance. We were able to get our frame time down quite a bit, just under 28 milliseconds. Similar timings again, 2 milliseconds Viz buffer, 3.5 base pass. But our shadow depth pass, we were able to get down all the way down to 3 milliseconds. And we actually ended up having a 2 millisecond graphics queue stall waiting for our async pass. So moving on to Lumen. So prior to UE5 and Lumen, we looked at a variety of GI solutions and ultimately found they were all lacking. A lot of times the quality wasn't there. They took extensive time baking. They had huge engine integration costs that would slow us down. Oftentimes they had all three. So definitely when UE5 came out with Lumen, this was one of the primary things driving us to UE5. Nanite's great. It's really showy. It helped a lot, and we couldn't have shipped without it. But we probably could have stayed on UE4. Lumen was definitely the thing that probably drew us to UE5 and said, yes, we should do this. And in that regards, it succeeded great. We were able to hit all of our lighting goals with an incredibly small lighting team. Remember, we have 2 lighters for the entire game. And this was really down to not being able or needing to bake. What you see is what you get, which really helped improve our iteration times and got things going quickly. Early on, we decided to focus on hardware ray tracing. There was a variety of things going into this decision, but the primary one was light bounce from landscapes. It's a little hard to see, but if you look at the top versus bottom, you get a lot more natural bounce on the hardware ray trace versus the bottom. It also tended to be a lot more accurate with a lot less light bleeding, which is always good. And this ultimately helped us ease transitions into ray trace shadows later in the project. So this was a win that we didn't even know we were getting. On Xbox, we were able to run this entirely on async compute, which saved us about 2 to 4 milliseconds on Series S in our test scenes. We also made extensive use of inline ray tracing on Xbox Series S, which saved in both performance and memory, since we could just not have to worry about any ray tracing shaders. We just did everything in compute, which was really nice. On PC, however, we do stay on the graphics queue with ray tracing, and this is really down to incomplete inline ray tracing support, D3, D12 versions of Unreal. But on async, or on software versions, you do go back to async. So here we have some comparisons. Here's a version of software Lumen in Intelligent Temple versus hardware. Here we've got one from Shatterscarp. You get a much better bounce if you can see under the bridge there. And here's a really nice one from the Swamp in ES, or Emerald Stair. Again, software versus hardware. So continuing on, one of the things that we were really lucky that we were able to take a huge advantage of in Lumen is emissives. Our emissive mushies, as our lighters like to call them, we were able to put all over the map and use these at a lot of times as full replacements for lighting. One of the ways we were able to really succeed in doing this is by using the ray tracing material node, which allowed us to specify separate values for the emissives on the diffuse or the rasterized scene versus the Lumen async scene. So we would have probably an emissive value of somewhere around 1 in the normal scene, but then have something like 5 or 10 in the ray tracing scene. And this allowed us to boost the light a lot without causing any blowout. That said, we still found ourselves making quite a big use of hidden emissive mesh cards in the scenes. These had minimal performance impact for us, just taking up surface cache space, but they did require us to modify the engine to remove them from the reflection passes. For hardware ray tracing, this was pretty easy. We just adjusted the ray tracing masks. We added a new flag, and it was culled. But for software Lumen, this did require adding additional culling passes for the mesh distance fields. And every once in a while, we'd still end up finding we needed a little bit more, so we'd fall back to non-shadow casting fill lights when we found that we were getting a little bit too noisy in the Lumen scene or we were losing the specularity. So Lumen worked out fairly well, but it definitely is a complicated beast, and we had some issues with it. One of the first things is there's a lot of passes in Lumen, a lot. And when you have both hardware and software pipelines to worry about, that gets even higher. There's some overlap in them, but there's a lot of divergence too. So if you're maintaining both, it can be a lot of work. And they can be extremely difficult to debug at times. Lumen uses a lot of indirection when it goes about building its scene. It'll have one pass that will generate a bunch of work lists that another pass will come through and consume. And this ends up breaking the association between the GPU threads and the pixels you see on screen. So if you've got issues with trying to figure out why something is rendering the wrong color or you're getting additional noise, it's a lot harder to backtrace to figure out which thread is actually the one doing the processing. Additionally, Lumen is, like I said, very memory intensive. And on Series S, this was always a problem for us. Series X a little bit, not as much, but Series S for sure. Lumen uses a lot of render targets in addition to those work groups, so it's going to increase your memory usage by quite a bit. And one of the things that we end up having to do on consoles to account for this is pretty much tossing away mesh distance fields in favor of our ray tracing VLASTs. We couldn't afford both, and this had a knock-on effect, as we'll see with some reflection stuff, as well as a lot of our VFX weren't able to take use of the distance fields nodes. And as a result, we had a lot of performance and quality battles. Every time we would increase the quality, we'd lose memory and runtime performance, and vice versa. So this was something that we struggled with and fine-tuned constantly. And of course, we didn't make it very easy for ourselves a lot of times. Lumen is a temporally accumulated effect, and when you have time of day jumps like we do, that doesn't work so well. So like when we were at middle of day and we'd switch to our party camp at night, we ended up literally throwing away the entire Lumen scene and trying to rebuild it as fast as we could behind a fade. Additionally, we had a lot of flickering lights, which themselves are not very temporally stable, so that added noise. And we ended up using a lot of bright VFX, which would mess with a lot of the Lumen screen effects. Moving on, some other issues or trip-ups we found. One of the big ones was how easy it is to waste your surface cache space. We use a lot of large meshes in Avowed. We always want that sense of monolithic things. And a lot of times they would sneak into the surface cache. They would just touch a little bit of the play space, and all of a sudden you'd be wasting about a fifth of your surface cache on a mountain that didn't affect the indirect scene. This is something that sometimes it's hard to catch until it's too late, and adds a lot of noise as you're constantly evicting pages to account for it. Additionally, a lot of our meshes were watertight, so we had back faces to them, so those would generate additional mesh cards that would sometimes end up in there. And ultimately, we just ended up doing the hard work of manually going in and removing these, and it took a little bit of time, so that's something we needed to come up with later, or a solution down the road. We did experiment with limiting mesh cards at times, especially near the end of the project. By default, Lumen, I think, generates about 12 mesh cards per object. And for something like a wall, you could easily get by with 1 or 2. So we would drop that down, and sometimes it worked, and then sometimes we'd get the mesh card on the back face. So either our option was increase the number of mesh cards, or what we ultimately ended up doing is adding a mod to bias which faces get their preference, so we could force it to the front. Lastly, on Lumen, or at least regular Lumen, it's got a lot of knobs to tweak. There's tons and tons of CVARs to adjust and fine tune. And then on top of that, you've got a lot of post-process settings that sit on top of it, and sometimes we'll adjust these further. And while a lot of these are important to adjust and safe, not all of them are, we found. In the worst case, or in some cases, we found that they would waste memory when they should actually be saving memory. Sometimes we'd find that they would generate and propagate nans down the rendering pipeline. And in worst cases, we found occasional GPU memory stomps as it would write out of LDS bounds. This is an example of it wasting memory that we found. This is the radiance cache screen probes when you set it to 96, which is the default setting for Xbox. It allocates the texture assuming you got a full square, but the indexing is actually logarithmic, so it clamps everything that's not a power of 2 all the way down to its smallest 1. So you end up wasting about a third of this texture. For us, we ended up just changing the way the texture was created, and that saved us there. But this is something to keep an eye out for. Lumen reflections. These by default on 5.3 were on the graphics queue, but thankfully it was really simple to move into the async queue, so I'd recommend doing it. Hit lighting was something that we added for PC, but unfortunately we're not able to get on Xbox. It ended up not being a huge deal in the long term because most of the ray traced hits were in the surface cache. It really only affects the dynamic stuff that was missing, but it was something we wish we could have done. That said, another trip up we found with lumen reflections is it proved to be quite difficult for our artists to figure out what was casting a lumen reflection and what wasn't. They like to work in textures and gradients, and so when you say, hey, anything below 0.4 is tracing, they'd be like, what does that mean? I got this from Photoshop. And then also, a lot of lumen reflections are ignorant of single layer water by default. So if you have any reflective surfaces underneath the single layer water plane, you're going to pay twice for the reflections. This is something we found in our Ringram's domain map where we had reflective ice underneath water, and so we ended up paying twice for reflections. We did modify the engine here to account for this. We pretty much took the single layer water depth buffer and then passed it to the reflections and then used a depth test there to save on those. Speaking of single layer water reflections, by default in 5.3, it was a full screen pass. You did a full screen space, and then whatever didn't hit, you went with a hardware ray traced full screen after that, which while looking nice was not very performant for us and definitely caused some trouble. Software Lumen is great to account for this and much cheaper if you don't get rid of your distance fields like we did. So ultimately, we looked at a couple different options. The initial one we did is, well, we can just downsample these passes, but because they're tied together, we ended up getting some really poor quality, especially on the screen space reflection part. We could look at screen space only reflections, which we did do on some of our lower end SKUs, but they do have some problems with exposure and light leaking. And while we did find an acceptable solution for this at the end, it's something that we wanted to avoid if we could, especially on some of the higher end targets like Xbox at 30 hertz. And of course, you have that issue of reflections disappearing as things start leaving the screen. So ultimately, we did another mod here where we modified it to do a hybrid approach. So we kept the full screen space reflections, and then we ended up doing a downsampling for the Lumen hardware. We pretty much worked on a quad and would write out a mask. So anything that didn't get the screen space, we would then go and take the coarser Lumen reflections. And that worked fairly well, especially on still water with little movement or pretty flat. You couldn't tell the difference. And even on some of the really rougher stuff, it barely showed up. And on this particular scene on Series S, it saved about 0.8 milliseconds, which is a big win. And another thing that I feel artists are constantly getting tripped up about is single layer water by default is always a perfect mirror for reflections. So a lot of times they would paint single layer water, or they put down a single layer water plane and then they paint in some muck like in the swamp to try to get timing back, unaware that that would still do a full lumen reflection trace. This is another place where I end up adding in a mod to do another max roughness trace that we tied to scalability. So moving along to shadows. So on Avowed, we did a variety of options for shadows or a collection of techniques. We used virtual shadow maps for our directional map. We used ray tracing for our local lights whenever we had ray tracing. And we used contact shadows for everything that was small along the ground or when we were doing our conversation lighting. Not to be too surprised by this, but shadows ended up being the bulk of our performance struggles even before we switched to ray tracing shadows, which actually saved us. And they contain a bulk of our modifications and additions. So virtual shadow maps, right off the bat, they're better than Cascade. There was no reason not to use them when we switched, especially with Nanite, they're kind of required. And they worked really well for the directional light. They allowed for those vast, distant far shadows in our vistas and saved us there. But performance-wise, they do require Nanite. If you're using VSMs, you have to use Nanite to get any sort of performance. And if you're using Nanite, you really should use VSMs unless you're doing some sort of ray tracing. But even then, we can find we still struggled with performance quite a bit. Anything that wasn't Nanite, or skinned meshes at the time, hurt, as well as anything that was per pixel evaluation in Nanite. So your masked materials, your WPO, your pixel depth offset. And that's one of the reasons why we worked really, really hard to get rid of as many masked materials as possible and turn off our WPO as early as possible. Additionally, shadow penumbras with virtual shadow maps have a cost. They have to sample the shadow map multiple times and use that to get softer shadows. And so that's another thing you have to keep in mind. That said, we did find a couple modifications that we thought we'd share that really helped with our virtual shadow maps. The first, and these are actually pretty easy modifications we made, so they work really well. The first is just reducing the number of shadow rays you're shooting at a distance. I think for us, this was about one line. We just take the scene depth, log it by 10, and then adjust accordingly. And on Series S in this particular shot, it saved about half a millisecond. That's a good win. Even more so, though, we found another mod in the Nanite instance culling where we could actually cull shadows under a certain pixel threshold and get a lot back. So in the top and the bottom, there's a difference of no culling versus a culling radius of 24. It's really hard to tell the difference. If you're looking right at them, you might be able to see it in the back with some of the pillars. And on Series S, in this particular scene, it saved us over 3 milliseconds. So this was a huge savings for us, and it was for 1 to 2 lines of code. Additionally, because we were doing ray tracing and our ray tracing LODs were generally much lower than our actual rasterization LODs, we ended up reusing these guys a lot for our directional lights. In this particular scene, we were able to save almost a millisecond by using our ray traced skinned meshes instead of our rasterization ones. And again, it's really hard to tell the difference if you're comparing them side by side. And then further in the project, we also added another smaller setting where we were able to adjust the light source radius on VSMs to reduce the projection costs there. And we use this for Series S or Series X 60 Hertz and lower NPCs. So ray trace shadows. The theory behind this and why we ended up exploring them was that our local light VSM invalidation was proving incredibly costly. Anytime you have a dynamic object going through a local light, it would invalidate it and it would want to re-render all of its shadow maps. Unreal does have the static separate to kind of account for this, but it doubles your memory, which is something we couldn't afford on the consoles. So we had to figure out other solutions. And that's really where ray tracing came in. We're only tracing the pixels we see on screen. We're not worrying about stuff behind characters or things that are occluded. Just trace what's on the screen. Additionally, with ray tracing shadows, you get free shadow penumbras, so that's always nice. And since we were already using hardware Lumen, we didn't have to worry about adding in any additional passes in the scene, just our ray tracing stuff, and then everything else was already paid for and accounted for. It also had the nice benefit of allowing for some sort of partial shadowing solutions where we could have things in the VSM shadow and not in the ray tracing shadow. So something like the tops of a cave, so they could receive shadows, but they wouldn't actually cast any on the local lights by just removing them from the ray tracing scene. We did this fairly often with trees to save time. So a little bit more about our ray tracing. This is something we actually implemented quite late in the project, and after our 5.3 upgrade, so about a year out from ship. We ended up using it for all local lights whenever ray tracing is enabled due to performance. And we ended up using a custom pass and denoiser that we wrote. The stock Unreal ray trace shadows, at least in 5.3, were not very performant for us. They pretty much use a full screen dispatch and render target per light. So if you've got 8 lights, that's 8 full screen passes and 8 render targets that it keeps off to denoise, which was not something we could afford. Additionally, we ended up having to create an inline volumetric fog version for our ray trace shadows, since that just used the regular ray tracing shader and we got rid of those. But we were actually then able to refactor the volumetric fog function just enough that we could kick off the shadows early on it and then hide their costs behind async Lumen. Most of the time we ended up using our volumetric fog shadows. We were in levels like this where we didn't actually have a directional light. So our async Lumen pass would end up running quite long compared to the graphics. And so we ended up getting ray traced volumetric fog shadows for free. So a little bit more about our custom pass. It's similar in theory to the VSM one pass projection. We pretty much use the cold light grid, trace the shadows, and then write them back into a packed shadow mask. This came about before Megalights was a thing, and even now Megalights is still experimental, so it works quite well for us. We supported 8 lights per pixel by default, and this was more just a don't go crazy with things lighting artists, and they were able to work with it means very well. We had 2 modes. We had a full screen pass where we allowed for 1 or more samples per pixels per light, which we used on high-end PCs. And then we had a checkerboard mode for consoles and lower quality things where we would render a checkerboard and then we would upscale and reconstruct and then retrace whatever we weren't confident with. This ended up being quite a bit under 1 sample per pixel per light. And we use this, like I said, on Xbox. And on Xbox Series S, it would on average save about 1 to 1.5 milliseconds. And here you can see where all the shadows are coming from and whatnot. So some comparison shots. First up, we have this one from Fiora. In alpha, we were sitting at about 40 milliseconds on Series S, 30 hertz, with about 11 milliseconds in our VSM shadow depths and 8 milliseconds on our projections. After we had made our change to ray tracing, we were able to get this down to about 25 milliseconds, spending 3 milliseconds on our VSM shadow depths and 3 milliseconds on our ray tracing. And then our projection was an additional 2 for VSMs. If we turned off ray tracing and just said, okay, let's just see what the content was, our ray tracing was still faster than our VSMs by about 4 milliseconds, with the VSM cost shooting back up to 9.5 and an additional 2 milliseconds for projections and filtering. If you were to compare it to the stock Unreal ray trace shadows, frame time was even worse. It was about 34 milliseconds, where you'd be spending 18 milliseconds on ray tracing and denoising. So it was definitely worthwhile to write that pass. Here's another example from Nakuku Bell. Alpha frame time for Series S 30 hertz was about 37.5 milliseconds, with 13 milliseconds of VSM shadow depths and 1.5 for projections. And the volumetric fog at this point was sequential with the rest of it. Our final frame time with all of our changes was about a little over 23 milliseconds. And we were spending 3.5 milliseconds on our ray trace shadows, and we had no VSMs at this point since there was no directional light. And these 2 milliseconds we were spending for the volumetric shadows were free. They were hidden behind our async Lumen costs. Again, turning off ray tracing and just using VSMs, we would jump up to 25.5 milliseconds, spending about 9.3 milliseconds on our shadow depths. And this is roughly what we saw, is that the more characters and dynamic objects in the lighting scene, the more you would get back from ray tracing. So a couple more notes about ray tracing. So on 5.3, not all of the passes were on async. Some of them were still in the graphics queue. We moved everything over to async, and this worked out well, and it was pretty easy. We also ended up moving the ray tracing scene update earlier in the frame. By default, it ran, I think, over the base pass. We moved it to run over the pre-Z and anti-viz buffer, and this saved us time. We did end up preventing landscapes from rebuilding every frame, which is the default behavior. This is done so that you can keep BLASs in sync with the landscape streaming. And in cases of really bad streaming performance, we do notice that they can get out of sync. But no one's really seemed to care or call out the issues, so I guess it's really not that much of an issue. In general, we did find that ray tracing saved us memory over distance fields, which was a big win. Our peak memory usage in DS on Series S was about 300 megabytes. If we were doing distance fields, we probably would have been about 500 or 600 megabytes more total, so savings of a couple hundred megabytes there. And we were also able to avoid any large GPU spikes from distance fields updates when we loaded in new world partition streaming cells. That said, ray tracing does have a higher CPU cost, at least to 5.3, and this was ultimately the reason why we couldn't afford it on Xbox Series S or Series X at 60 hertz. Our CPU times for collecting the ray tracing scene were just too high that they were pushing us over, and we needed to keep those as low as we could. So a little bit more on virtual textures. Actually making good time. Pretty much all of our textures in our game used the virtual texture system, with the exception of VFX and RVT textures. Those we needed pretty much right away and couldn't wait for feedback. They gave us more textures at a higher resolution and lowered and fixed our memory usage, which was always nice. But they did have the negative effect of making us texture address bound pretty much everywhere we used them. We weren't able to benefit from the vertex pixel shader pre-caching, so they hit the texture addressing unit pretty hard. Additionally, we had to spend extra effort on balancing the pools. We ended up trying and segregating our textures a bit. All of our character textures that we could, we threw into BC7s at 1K and environments at DXT1 at 2K. And this was really because we have found that a lot of times our environment textures, even when we weren't oversubscribed, were kicking out our character textures. And we needed those guys to be resident as we would cut from gameplay into conversation, so we wouldn't see the texture streaming. In the future, it'd be nice if we could find a way to keep them all in the same pool, but still have ways of segregating them. So that's something we'll probably look at in the future. Additionally, we had to spend extra effort to make sure that only the pools we wanted were created. By default, you get 15 pools max, and then you hard crash. You can, of course, increase this to 31, but you're doubling your overhead, which in a memory-constrained environment isn't ideal. And a lot of times it's very easy to create pools you don't want. One of the easiest examples is our artist would hook up the default engine virtual texture or default engine normal texture, which is a 1x1 texture that is an RGBA8, which means we are now creating an RGBA pool that we don't want. So we ended up doing the simple thing. We created a 2x2 that we could then block compress and then fit in the pool we wanted it in and use that. But that was something that it's very easy to create when you don't need. We did also run into some weird issues with the material layering system in virtual textures. If our artist used a texture in the base function or material function for the virtual or for the layered system and then relied on that, it would never actually get properly added to the texture array that needs to pre-cache before you load the material. So you'd end up with a race condition between the texture loading and the material loading. And if you got the material loaded first, you'd get an invalid virtual texture binding, which would persist until that material is reloaded. A lot of times that meant we were getting bad normals on our characters because those were missed. So wrapping up a little bit with some final thoughts. First on the stuff we went. If there's one thing I'd say in general, especially as a smaller team, don't binding the engine works really, really well. For Nanite, definitely prefer more geometry and simpler materials. We found work a lot better. If you can, avoid any of the per pixel evaluation costs whenever you can. So your mass materials, PDO, and turn off WPO whenever you can. Of course, limiting your material variances also helps. This will help ray tracing as well, but Nanite likes to draw on material-wide things. So if you can have the least amount of them, you'll have the least amount of draw calls there. And if you can do variations through CPDs, do it. And of course, make sure you're working with world partition to control what is loaded. Nanite can rasterize a lot really fast, but it still can get clogged down if you're trying to render a lot of small things that don't need to be. For Lumen, definitely I'd say make sure to pay attention to what is in your surface cache. Like I said, it's really easy to waste space there. And of course, it's important to fine tune with the CVARs, but be careful and make sure you're aware of what they're doing and keeping track of them. Changing them all in one go, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. And in general, I'd say it's a lot easier to go from hardware to software than software to hardware. So if you're starting a project, I'd say err on the side of starting with hardware. It's a lot easier to go downgrade yourself to software than it is to add back in the hardware support later on. For shadows, definitely don't be beholden to a single solution. VSMs work great for the directional light we found, but they definitely can struggle with local lights. Ray trace shadows, on the other hand, work really well with the local lights, your point lights, your spotlights, your rect lights. So if you can, and you're already doing it, look into that. And of course, contact shadows, don't sleep on them. They seem to have a bad rap, especially at our studio, as being expensive, but they end up being a lot cheaper than the other options, so I don't know why you wouldn't. Virtual textures, they're liberating, but they're not free. And of course, keep an eye on your pools. Some other final things that are just agnostic to it that we found worked really, really well. Of course, establishing your benchmark hardware early on is really important, we feel. Consoles are ideal for this. They have fixed costs. You don't have to worry about any other processes kicking in, nor are you at the whims of drivers from graphics cards. For us, we chose the Xbox Series S, and this we found out worked really, really well. And of course, finding a parity in performance when shipping on multiple devices works great too. Find the settings on Xbox Series X that kind of mimic the performance you want on Series S, and then go from there. And it'll keep them more or less in line. Definitely, I would say disable dynamic resolution during development. In my opinion, it should be there to cover spikes in gameplay and whatnot and not cover up non-performance. And if you've got this on during development, you more or less have your head in the sand with no real idea of what the GPU is doing and what the state it's in. So having that turned off and being actually aware of where the GPU is and where you stand is important. And when you actually do start optimizing and looking at your frame time, make sure to turn off async work when you're optimizing passes. It will overlap and skew timings. So a lot of times you'll be like, oh, I'm making progress. And then you're like, oh, actually, I'm not. It's just how the work overlapped. Definitely also always be profiling. We had weekly performance meetings where we would sit down and we would play the game, or more specifically, we'd have a QA person play the game and we watched and made comments. And that was great for keeping an eye on what was actually going on in the game. We could take captures during it, and we had just, even if we weren't necessarily fixing things, we at least knew what was going on and where things would change. We also had an auto player system, which I highly recommend getting if you haven't. It helps keep track of you making progress and allowed us to really kind of fill out the world where gameplay wasn't catching it. And of course, keep and revisit old captures is another one that I would definitely recommend. We took a lot of PIX captures during development, and it's really easy for you to make big engine changes, whether upgrading the engine or a bunch of content goes in, and have performance regressions. If you're keeping old captures and you occasionally check them, you can see those regressions and you can catch them and you can fix them. For us specifically, an example is we had our super sampler. We were using FSR2 on Xbox. And at some point we had upgraded to FSR3, and we actually had a performance regression down to 3 milliseconds from our top, or maybe it was a whole millisecond of difference. And we didn't catch it for a while. It was only going back and looking at an old capture that we're like, we regressed here, and what's going on? And then we found, comparing it, well, there wasn't much difference when we went from FSR 2 to 3, so let's just go back to 2, and we saved ourselves some time there. And with that, I'm pretty much all done, and I'd just like to say thank you to all these people who helped me with my presentation and everything, and actually have time for questions, so that's really nice. Thank you.